want to move to the first movement then is the abolitionist movement. And my example for the abolitionist movement is John Brown, who kind of embodies, personifies the abolitionist movement for many, and especially the violence of the abolitionist movement, in which Brown engaged in numerous acts of violence, including his most famous one was the failed raid at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in October of 1859, in which he tried to, which he did temporarily seize the arsenal in Harper's Ferry, which was guarded by one person. I wish our arsenals were guarded by one people today, but it was guarded by one person, and he occupied that, seized it, and held it temporarily before being captured by Union troops at that time headed by a guy named General Lee. Of course, we'll later switch sides. Now, what Brown does is Brown powerfully identifies with the oppressed. His philosophy is really guided by Hebrews 13:3, which says, "Remember them that are in bonds as if bound with them." Remember them that are in bonds as if bound with them. In other words, Brown, like many other abolitionists, like William Lloyd Garrison, for example, Wendell Phillips, Brown tried to think, to feel, and to act like the enslaved, like he was enslaved himself. He didn't just sympathize with the slaves. In other words, he empathized with them. He tried to place himself in their shoes as much as possible. This translates into where he lived, where he worked, where he organized. He moved his entire family up to a free slave black community up in North Elba, New York, up kind of by Lake Placid. He tried to identify with black folks in general and with slaves in particular so much that Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois, provocatively suggests that Brown was, for all practical purposes, black. And Lerone Bennett, who was the editor of Ebony magazine in the 60s and 70s, similarly makes the same point when he writes, "There was in John Brown a complete identification with the oppressed. It was his child that a slave owner was selling, his sister who was being whipped in the field, his wife who was being raped in the gin house. It was not happening to Negroes, it was happening to him. John Brown was a Negro, and it was in this aspect that he suffered." John Brown was a Negro, and it's in this aspect that he suffered. It's this powerful, near total identification with blackness, rather than his religious zeal, really, is that what made Brown an insane fanatic in the eyes of whites of his times, and made him a hero to so many African Americans, too. So what Brown, therefore, did is he saw violence against slavery. Given that he had powerfully identified with the enslaved, and given that he saw slavery as essentially a relationship of violence between masters and slaves, he therefore saw violence against slavery as essentially a form of self-defense. And the example I want to give is an example of Potawatomi, Kansas. Potawatomi, Kansas is an incident that even John Brown's sympathizers have a hard time with and see as an act of terrorism and cold-blooded murder. Because what takes place in Potawatomi is this is in 1858, I want to make sure, yes, in 1855 rather. It's in Potawatomi, Kansas, and Brown basically takes a group of 5 men, his sons and some friends, and they go to the homes of 5 pro-slavery ruffians, they call them, people from Missouri who were trying to make Kansas into a slave state. He goes in the middle of the night, goes to these homes, takes the men out of the homes, and Brown's men hack them to death with broadswords in the middle of the night, and leave them there for dead. So as you can see how even those who like John Brown have a hard time explaining this act of what seems to be clearly terroristic violence. But what Brown, in fact, argues is that this is not a form of not a terroristic assault. This is a form of self-defense. He says, look, Brown considered this an act of self-defense because you have to look at the political climate of Kansas at the time. The pro-slavery legislature in Kansas was elected in 1855 by 5,000 armed men from Missouri, these pro-slavery ruffians, who basically ride on horseback from the Missouri line into Kansas, vote, and then most of them head back. And they, after they established this bogus legislature, the legislature passed laws that, for example, that stated that only pro-slavery men could hold office or serve as jurors. This pro-slavery legislature punished the very discussion of whether slavery in Kansas exists or does not exist. Right? To even discuss whether slavery exists in Kansas was punishable by at least 2 years imprisonment. They also authorized the death penalty for inciting slaves to rebel. In addition, pro-slavery settlers had openly threatened Brown's family, promising to annihilate, quote, those damn Browns. And they also promised to protect the pro-slavery government in Kansas until every damned abolitionist was in hell. Brown, in that context, Brown felt it was necessary, quoting him, to show by actual work that there are two sides to this thing. He thought it was necessary to defend anti-slavery Kansans from pro-slavery attacks, including protecting his family, even if that meant murdering pro-slavery ruffians in the middle of the night. So in this context, Brown saw his acts as a form of defense. He saw violence as being built into the ontology of the enslaved, and he powerfully identifies with the slave, remembering them as bonds as if bound himself. So therefore, violence committed on their behalf is essentially a form of self-defense, not of himself. Now, Paul Hill, one of the more notorious killers in the pro-life movement, is going to make a similar defense of his actions. Might not know as much about Paul Hill, so I'll basically tell you what Paul Hill did. In the early mornings of July 29, 1994, Paul Hill walked up to Dr. John Britton's pickup truck as he pulled into the parking lot of the Ladies Center in Pensacola, Florida. The Ladies Center was a place that performed abortions, and John Britton was a doctor who performed abortions. Paul Hill walked up to Dr. Britton and his bodyguards that morning and blew him away and shot him. He then, after killing Britton, killing his bodyguard, and seriously wounding the bodyguard's spouse, Hill then set his gun in the grass, sat down, waited for the police to arrive and to arrest him. Hill was a former minister in a fundamentalist Presbyterian church. He was quickly found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and he was sentenced to death, and he was executed in 2003.